The morning my brother slid a single key across the estate solicitor's desk and told me it was my share of Dad's estate. I had $43 in my checking account, half a tank of gas in my truck, and no idea that the rusted padlock the key opened was about to change every single thing about the next year of my life. He kept the house on Elm Street, the one our parents had bought in 1987 for $78,000, and that the township had last assessed at just over $610,000. He kept the registered retirement savings, the GIC my father had been building quietly for 15 years, the 2019 Buick Enclave that still had plastic on the floor mats because Dad drove it like he was trying to protect it for someone. He kept the coin collection, the fishing gear, the flat-screen television still in its box because Dad had never gotten around to setting it up. I got a single key and a folded legal description of a concrete block workshop on a back lot at the edge of town, flagged in the property assessment as requiring significant structural remediation, valued at $22,500. The solicitor cleared his throat. My brother's wife sat beside him, her leather bag already zipped, already looking toward the door. "It's what your father wanted," my brother said, buttoning his jacket. "He felt you were established in your own life. He felt the family home should stay intact within the family." I had spent the past 3 years driving 2 hours every second weekend from my rented basement apartment in Ottawa to sit with Dad on his back porch and talk about the senators and the state of his tomato plants and whether the creek behind the Legion had cleared up enough for pickerel. I had taken 2 weeks off without pay the previous winter when Dad had a fall and needed someone in the house. My brother had come for Christmas and sent a grocery delivery service the rest of the time. "He never mentioned any of this to me," I said. "People's priorities shift as they get older," my brother said. "You know how he was in the last year." I did know. That was the problem. The man who had shaken my hand at Christmas and asked me sharp, specific questions about the timber frame addition I was working on out in Almonte was not a man whose priorities had shifted in any direction except toward wanting his son to have what was his. Something had shifted, but it wasn't Dad. I picked up the key off the table and walked out. The drive to Merrickville took 40 minutes. I passed the Tim Hortons, where Dad had met his friends on Friday mornings, since approximately the beginning of time, past the hardware store where he knew the name of everyone who worked the counter, past the little clock shop on the main street that used to be his before he retired, now an antique dealer's. The town was November gray, the maples stripped bare, the Rideau River running fast and dark on the other side of the bridge. The workshop was off County Road 43, behind a lumberyard that had closed when I was in grade school. I had been inside it more times than I could count, as a kid and as an adult. Dad had bought the property at a municipal tax sale in the early 90s for almost nothing, and used it ever since as his overflow space, somewhere to store the clocks he was restoring, the tools he'd accumulated over 40 years of trade work, the wooden parts and blanks he needed to dry slowly before they could be used. After he retired, it became less storage and more refuge. Somewhere to go that was his own, 4 or 5 mornings a week, with no particular agenda except to work with his hands at his own pace. When I pulled up in front of it, the building looked like it had been shut for years. The corrugated tin roof sagged at the east corner. The concrete block walls were streaked rust brown from the gutters, and a birch tree had grown up hard against the south wall, its trunk thick now, pale bark, pressed against the masonry like it was trying to get inside. Weeds had cracked through the gravel out front and died there, standing brown and frozen in the November ground. I sat in the truck, with the engine running and the heater going, and looked at it. My father had owned this property for 30 years. He had left it specifically to me, by name, in a will that my brother swore reflected his true wishes. My father, who never bought anything without a reason, who never kept anything he had no use for, who still had his original watchmaker's tools from his apprenticeship in 1971, because good tools are good tools and you keep what is worth keeping. He had a reason. I didn't go inside that evening. The truth is, I couldn't. I drove back to the Tim Hortons on the highway and sat in the parking lot until they stopped refilling my coffee at 9 o'clock, and then I drove back to the lane behind the lumberyard and parked in front of the workshop and climbed into the back seat of the crew cab with the emergency blanket I keep behind the seat, because I couldn't afford a motel and I didn't have anywhere else I needed to be. I lay there in the dark, listening to the wind move through the birch tree against the wall, and I finally let myself think about my father the way I hadn't let myself since the funeral. Not Dad the problem to be solved. Just Dad. The way he held a clock movement up to the light when he was diagnosing what was wrong with it. The way he pronounced my name when he was telling me something he considered important, slowly, like it mattered that I heard it right. The way he'd been on that back porch in October, 2 months before the end, looking out at his garden going brown and saying, mostly to himself, it had a good run this year. I wept in the back seat of my truck in a frozen gravel lot in Merrickville in November, and I am not ashamed of it. He was my father. He deserved to be wept for. But by the time the sky started to go gray, something else had settled into my chest, stubborn and cold and very clear. He had a reason. I went inside. The workshop smelled exactly the way it always had, machine oil and sawdust, and the particular dry, papery smell of old clock mechanisms. It smelled like being 12 years old and watching my father work. Everything was laid out with the careful order he brought to everything in his life. Tools on the benches in their designated spots, clocks on the shelves in various stages of restoration, wooden parts in labeled coffee cans sorted by type and size. The cast-iron wood stove sat cold in the corner. The shelving units beside it reached to the ceiling, packed with 30 years of organized accumulation. And against the west wall, where there had never been anything before, stood a longcase clock. I was certain it hadn't been there on any previous visit. It was dark walnut, old, the hood carved in a style more ornate than my father's usual repair work. It had been placed with a deliberateness that was different from the natural accumulation of everything else. Centered on the wall, visible from the door, impossible to miss when you came in. I crossed the cold floor and opened the hood. The movement was original. The weights hung from their chains, but the left weight hung too low, heavier than it should have been, and when I lifted it carefully free, it was immediately wrong, too light for its size, hollow, a brass cylinder capped at both ends. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with waxed cord, was a folded piece of paper. My father's handwriting, the careful block print he had used my entire life. If you're reading this, you came to the right place. I knew you would. The shelves beside the stove. Third board from the left, second row from the bottom. Push, don't pull, there's a latch. I'm sorry it had to be this way. He was always in the room. I couldn't speak freely. Everything I need you to have is inside. I read it twice. Then I went to the shelving unit beside the wood stove. Third board from the left, second row from the bottom. The board looked identical to every other board, same gray primer paint, same rough pine, same decades of dust worked into the grain. I pressed the heel of my hand flat against it and pushed. The board gave slightly. Something clicked inside the wall. The entire shelving unit, which was not fixed to the wall, only resting against it, swung outward on a hidden hinge, opening like a door, revealing a gap in the concrete block behind it. Not a gap, an opening that had been cut into the original masonry, framed with lumber, insulated, sealed with a fitted panel of drywall, painted to match the surrounding wall. Behind it was a space the size of a small closet, a bare bulb on a pull string that still worked, a short wooden shelf near the floor, hand-built, to keep things off the cold ground. On that shelf sat a gray steel lockbox, fireproof, combination dial, the kind sold for document storage. On top of it, held down by a flathead screwdriver, was another note. The combination is the year Mum and I got married. You know it. Don't let him tell you I didn't know what I was doing. I knew exactly what I was doing. My parents were married in 1981. The dial turned smoothly. The box opened cleanly. Inside, sealed in a Ziploc bag to protect against moisture, was a stack of documents that I carried to the workbench and spread under the fluorescent light with hands that weren't entirely steady. The first document was a will, dated 14 months before Dad died. Two witnesses whose names I didn't recognize, and a notary public stamp from Perth that was crisp and clear and unambiguous. The will revoked all previous versions. It directed the family home to be sold, and the proceeds split equally between his sons. It directed the same for the financial accounts. It specifically flagged a date. A date I recognized as falling exactly 2 weeks after my brother had arrived in Merrickville for what he'd told me was a quick visit to help Dad get his paperwork sorted out. The second document was bank statements, printed off and annotated in red pen. Over 18 months, $214,000 had been moved from my father's savings accounts in increments that never exceeded $9,000 at a time, into an account number my father had circled and labeled in his careful print, his business account. I found the forwarded statements in my email. He set up forwarding without telling me. The third document was a letter. 4 pages, handwritten on lined notepaper, dated 8 months before the end. I am writing this while he is at the hardware store. I have perhaps 20 minutes. I will not reproduce all of it here. It took me 2 readings to get through because I had to stop twice. The essence of it was this. My father had asked my brother for help with his taxes 18 months earlier, and in doing so had given him access to the financial accounts. Over the months that followed, my brother had gradually taken over everything. The appointments, the phone calls, the correspondence, positioning himself as the manager of an old man's affairs, while the old man was still entirely capable of managing them himself. He sat in on every medical appointment. He answered the phone when it rang. He told the neighbors, and eventually the solicitor, that Dad was having memory difficulties. When my father discovered the transfers and confronted my brother directly, my brother cried and apologized and promised to repay everything. 2 days later, he drove my father to a solicitor my father had never met and had him sign documents that were presented as updated estate planning paperwork. My father did not fully understand what he had signed until he tried, a month later, to retrieve his own will from the original solicitor and was told his file had been transferred. The letter ended, "I am not a confused old man. I am an old man who trusted his son and I am paying for it. Everything that is rightfully yours is in the lockbox. There is also a beneficiary designation form for 3,000 shares in a private property company registered out of Kingston. I put them in a numbered company I set up specifically so he would never find them. They are worth approximately $190,000 at the last valuation. They go to you directly, outside the estate, and he cannot touch them regardless of what any will says. The workshop is yours because it is the one place he has never once set foot in. He always called it worthless. Take care of the clocks." I was sitting on Dad's stool with both hands flat on the bench on either side of the documents when I heard gravel crunch outside. Headlights swept across the small workshop window. A car door opened and closed. My brother walked through the door. He took in the open shelving unit, the open lockbox, the documents spread across the bench. His expression moved through several things in quick succession and settled on something controlled and cold. "Your sister-in-law called me when you left Smith's Falls," he said. "I came straight down." "You were waiting to see what I found," I said. He didn't argue it. He moved toward the bench slowly, the way you approach something you mean to take. His coat was the long charcoal wool one he wore in the city. He looked entirely wrong in the workshop. "Before you do anything with those documents, you need to think clearly. That will is not going to survive a challenge. Your father's medical records will establish that he lacked testamentary capacity when he signed it. I have a relationship with his physicians that you don't. You have no resources for a legal fight, and I have considerable ones. This does not have to go the way you're thinking." "I'm going to the OPP," I said. He crossed the remaining distance fast and grabbed my wrist. The phone I had been using to photograph documents clattered to the floor. He was heavier than me, and for a moment I was pinned back against the workbench, with his face close to mine, and his voice very quiet and very controlled, telling me to think carefully about the next 30 seconds of my life. I stopped pulling against his grip. I let my body go still. He eased back slightly. That was his mistake. I drove my knee hard into the side of his thigh, wrenched my wrist free, grabbed the Ziploc bag from the bench, and ran for the door. He caught my jacket collar in the doorway. The seam tore, and then I was out into the dark, running across the gravel toward the old lumberyard buildings, the ground frost-slick, the cold slamming into my lungs. I could hear him behind me for maybe 20 seconds before the combination of dress, shoes, frozen gravel, and the darkness between the old lumber sheds sorted out the pursuit on their own. I came around to my truck from the back angle, had the engine running before he made it around the corner of the building, and was on County Road 43, heading north before he reached his rental car. I drove to the OPP detachment in Smiths Falls and told the officer at the desk that I needed to report financial elder abuse and fraud related to my father's estate. I laid the Ziploc bag on the counter. He called someone from the back. A detective named Osi arrived 20 minutes later. Methodical, precise, wearing reading glasses, she took off and put back on several times as she went through the documents. She asked careful, specific questions. She did not tell me I was confused or that this wasn't something the OPP could act on. When she finished reading my father's letter, she set it down and looked at me over her glasses. The transfer pattern is consistent with structuring, she said. Keeping amounts under 10,000 to avoid automatic reporting thresholds. That's an offense under the Proceeds of Crime Act, separate from the estate fraud and the elder financial abuse charges. She tapped the letter. This is all his handwriting? My whole life, I said. She looked at the letter again for a moment. Your father was a very careful man. He spent 40 years fixing things other people had given up on, I said. He noticed when something wasn't running right. The investigation moved faster than I had any right to expect. The Perth notary confirmed the will's authenticity within 48 hours. A forensic accountant working with the OPP's Financial Crimes Unit traced the diverted funds to my brother's numbered company, which had been using them to cover cost overruns on a condominium project in Scarborough that was badly over budget. The Ontario Securities Commission was notified about the share transfers. Within 10 days, my brother's accounts were frozen pending investigation. He was arrested on a Tuesday morning at his Toronto office building. Right in the middle of a meeting with his project lenders, I found out later. His lawyer entered a not guilty plea that the evidence did not support for long. My father's letter will held up in probate. His letter, dated, specific, coherent, referencing account numbers and transfer dates that matched the bank records exactly, was not the writing of a man who did not know what he was doing. The independent review of his medical records found no clinical basis for the claim of testamentary incapacity. The claim was withdrawn. My brother was convicted the following spring. 4 years in a federal institution, a restitution order for the full amount transferred plus interest. The family home sold. The proceeds split as my father had directed. The Kingston Property Company shares transferred to me through the beneficiary designation. Outside the estate entirely, exactly as Dad had planned it. I did not buy a newer truck. I did not move anywhere. The first thing I did, the very first thing, before I sorted out anything else, was drive back to Merrickville. I hired local crews, people from the area, people who knew my father by name from the Friday morning Tim Hortons table, to fix the roof and repoint the mortar and replace the gutters and relay the gravel apron out front. I cut down the birch tree that had been pressing into the south wall. I insulated the workshop properly, put in baseboard heating, replaced the fluorescent tubes with warmer LED strips that didn't make everything look like a hospital corridor. Every tool I left in the place my father had put it. Every clock I left on its shelf. I learned clock repair slowly and badly at first, then less badly. A retired horologist in Kingston, who had known my father professionally, agreed to take me on for a course in basic movement cleaning and regulation. I started taking in small jobs, simple servicing work to begin with, and found that the patience the work required was not different in kind from finished carpentry. You are reading something small and precise, locating where it has gone out of true, correcting it carefully, and returning it to running order. You are paying attention to what is actually there, rather than what you assumed would be there. The false wall behind the shelving unit I left exactly as it is. The shelf still swings outward on its hidden hinge when you push the third board from the left, second row from the bottom. The space behind it is empty now, the lockbox sitting on the workbench, but I didn't fill it in or seal it up. It was the most deliberate thing my father ever built in that workshop. A hiding place for the truth, constructed by a man who was running out of time and options, and still found a precise and careful way to protect what he loved. The longcase clock runs on the west wall where he placed it. Its tick carries through the whole workshop in the mornings. On the wall beside the clock, I hung a small frame, the original note from the oilcloth cylinder, his handwriting behind glass. If you're reading this, you came to the right place. I knew you would. My father spent 40 years repairing things other people had decided were too far gone to bother with. He believed, in a practical and unsentimental way, that patience and careful attention applied to a broken mechanism could return it to running true. He bought a concrete block workshop that everyone, including his own elder son, had written off as worthless. He filled it with decades of his knowledge and craft, and, at the very end, with the one thing that mattered most, a room no one else knew existed, holding the truth in his own handwriting, waiting for the right person to come and find it. He left me the one place my brother never once stepped inside, because he understood something his elder son never did, that the only things safe from a man who values only what something is worth are the things he has already decided are worthless. He was right about all of it. I just had to come home to find out.